Welcome to all of those who are here in this room at the Domaine de Pente, our location in Geneva. Welcome also to all of those who follow this press conference, either by Zoom or directly on the internet on our website, www.pressclub.ch, or on our different digital channels, YouTube and others. We are going to have a press conference today about a very important topic, human rights in the United Arab Emirates. It comes up at a precise moment. Yesterday at the UN, at the Human Rights Council, there was the review of the human rights of this country, and today we will have some testimony, some analysis about the situation there in the United Arab Emirates. This session will be chaired by Emma Farge. Emma Farge is a senior Reuters correspondent here in Geneva, and she will take over, and without any other comments, I give you the floor. Emma, the floor is yours. Thank you. You got.
Thanks so much, and thanks everyone for being here today. It's always a little bit depressing when you have to revisit a topic that you've already written about. Matthew Hedges did an interview with me, I think 3 years ago when I first joined Geneva, about the situation after his detention in the UAE, and that is still very much a topic today, and according to some of the speakers, it seems to have gotten worse. So as Pierre said, it's a timely moment. There was the review yesterday in the UN of the UAE's human rights record, and I'd very much like to hear the feedback from the panelists on how that went. The comments that I saw did bring up the question of detainees, but didn't seem to be too critical, was what I took from it. The other thing is that it's been just over a year since the 10-year sentence for many of the people who were actually detained in the UAE as part of the UAE 94 were supposed to have been set free. So there's some people who should have been set free more than a year ago. So that's why we're talking about this today. And I've got an excellent set of panelists today. And I'll start on my right with Falah Sayed, Human Rights Officer at MENA Rights Group. She can tell us about the sharp end of things. She litigates cases of human rights violations happening in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and conducts legal and policy research on patterns of violations in the region. Also, Matthew Hedges, to her right over here, an academic focusing on authoritarianism, and his research meant that he was actually detained, tortured, and sentenced to life imprisonment on charges of espionage when he was in the UAE. He's got multiple legal cases and is seeking justice and accountability. So I look forward to hearing from you as well. Ahmed al-Shaiba al-Nuaimi is an Emirati journalist and activist, and one of the Al-Islah reforming group leaders. Ahmed's brother is detained in the UAE now, and is one of those people that I mentioned who has been in jail for more than 10 years now, and has served his sentence but has not been freed. So would like to hear about your brother's story as well as your own difficulties with the government. Finally, last but not least, Jenan Al Marzooqi, who is joining us virtually today. She's an Emirati human rights activist and the daughter of the Emirati prisoner of conscience, Abdulsalam Mohammed Darwish Al-Marzooqi, who was arrested on July 24th, 2012 as part of the UAE authorities' crackdown on the UAE 94. She's going to tell us about what she knows about her father today. So welcome to all the panelists. Look forward to hearing from you. The first speaker will be Ahmed, please. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, everyone, for attending this meeting, which is very important for our people and our country, the United Arab Emirates. I think we should know about what happened there. Especially yesterday, we know that the Universal Period Review of the UN Human Rights Council conducted the review during a meeting at the Palace of Nations in Geneva, here where we meet. This is a great opportunity to tell you about what happened in the United Arab Emirates for our group and the people who are now detained for 10 years. Actually, more than 10 years. It's 11 years now. This problem, I don't like to read, actually. I want to use my words now to talk to you and tell you the fact. How is it in the United Arab Emirates? Unfortunately, first of all, I have to say that the situation in the United Arab Emirates of the human rights getting worse and worse since it began in 2011. And when we talk about this story, it's very important to know. Some of it I know, most of you know about it, but I'm gonna tell you this story, what we are talking about today, and the people who are detained, their crime that they wrote a petition for the government to call for democracy. Nowadays, that we saw them in the jail because of their words and because there is no freedom of speech in the United Arab Emirates. Why? The authority of the United Arab Emirates prefer not to have any democracy in the government or in the social life. Those groups where I will talk about through my brother's story, Khaled, they are civil, peaceful people. They've been in the United Arab Emirates as an organization, a civil organization called al-Islah Group since 1974, and they did not accused of any crime since that time. My brother Khaled, who was arrested in 2012 in July, 14 July in 2012, he was arrested and he was in secret prison. No one knew where he was at that time. My family tried to reach anywhere to find how is he, because he was actually ill. He had problems, severe problem in his back. So they tried just to, they were aware about his health, but no answer from the government. And that's the situation for all the people who were detained at that time. No one knows where they are. That problem took months until my family could see him, but they were shocked. They couldn't recognize him because what happened for his health, for his body. They couldn't recognize my brother, even his children, when they saw him. That because of the torture, that because of the situation they were in, the jail, and then the trial, which is actually not a real trial, began with them to accuse them, and they had sentence for 10 years. I got a sentence for 15 years because I'm outside. My brother and his friends took this punishment, as you know, because they call for democracy with the other groups, actually not al-Islah group who called for democracy, but the other groups as well in the United Arab Emirates, all of them, they call for democracy. And the majority of the people, they are from al-Islah group. Now, after that, they get the sentence. Nowadays that we see the authority of the United Arab Emirates, they don't respect even their law and their decision to put them in a jail for 10 years. My brother and other detainees, they are now spending more than their sentences. Some of them completed their sentences from since 2016 and 2017, and they are still in jail. They created something new which called counseling department, which is al-Munasaha. It's called al-Munasaha in Arabic, and that means that they can extend their detention for unlimited time. 4 years now, some of them spent more than their sentences, 4 years, and my brother now has faced the same problem. More than 56 people, they have the same problem now in the jail of Al-Rizin. It's called Al-Rizin jail in the United Arab Emirates. I know the health of my brother, who is now more than 70 years old. He's in a bad health. He's in, there's no health care, real health care in that jail. And we know many of the activists in the United Arab Emirates, whoever called for democracy, after this problem happened in 2012, they arrested many of them, like Nasser bin Ghaith. You know Nasser bin Ghaith. He's a professor in the university, the university in France. Sorbonne University, and Ahmed Mansour, who's very well known as an activist and a human rights activist in the world. So now they all face the same problem. I have met one of the people who were detained with Ahmed Mansour. He told me that when he saw him, he thought he is a person who is in his 70s, while he's in his 50s, because of what he faced in this in the jail when he detained in UAE jail. The problem now, as I told you, is increased, and the hope that the United Arab Emirates people they had to have a democracy life and freedom of speech, they are losing that. And what shocked us, that many of the countries, many of the democracy countries, where we thought they will stand with the people who want a democracy in the world, we don't see that. We don't see the face that they show. And unfortunately, the United Arab Emirates show the face of tolerance and to be a peaceful country, but in fact, inside it's different. And who support them with showing this face, this facade for that authority? Unfortunately, some of the democracy countries, which we expected to be more justice with our situation. We are call all the world. We call those democracy countries to understand that we are losing our people who call for democracy and for the right of speech, for the free world. I myself lost my son, who was handicapped, who was disabled. He couldn't join me and my family, who could escape after 2 years trying to join me in the United Kingdom. I lost my son who disabled because that authority banned him from travel, banned even many of my family members. The problem does not actually stop on the detainees' life. It's extended for their relative, their families, and unfortunately now all the society in the United Arab Emirates, they face the same problem, scared from this authority. We call the free world to stop that, to try to have pressure on that government to stop their violence against human rights. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Ahmed. That was really powerful. Let's move on to another personal account, video message from Janan now, who's going to talk about her father, who's still in detention. Thanks.
It is my honor to stand before you today and speak about a critical issue that demands our immediate attention. We all know that human rights are fundamental to the well-being and dignity of every human being, yet they are being systematically violated in the UAE. Over the past decade, the UAE has been one of the most outrageous human rights violators in the Gulf. The Emirati regime has arbitrarily detained, tortured, and imprisoned tens of citizens and has curtailed the basic freedoms of expression, association, and assembly. The government has shown little respect for the rule of law and due process and has consistently disregarded international norms and human rights standards. The story of my father is a clear example of the UAE's human rights violations. He has been held illegally by the Emirati regime for more than 10 years. He was targeted for advocating democratic reforms in the country, which resulted in him being subjected to enforced disappearance, torture, solitary confinement for 8 months, and a flawed trial that led to a 10-year sentence. He's not alone in this ordeal, as 94 Emirati men and women were falsely accused of trying to overthrow the government, and the majority of them were given extreme prison sentences. My father's case is just one of many. There are currently at least 70 political prisoners being held in the UAE, in which 51 of them, including my father, had their sentences extended with no fair trial or due process. The regime continues to target activists, journalists, and human rights defenders, and has blocked UN experts from conducting in-country research and visiting prisons and detention facilities. On the other hand, I want to talk about the suffering that families and relatives of detainees in the UAE face. As many of you may know, the UAE government has a track record of repressing and detaining activists and dissents. But what is not often talked about is how the government also targets the families of those who speak out against the regime. My own family has experienced this firsthand. Ever since my father was arrested, we have been subjected to arbitrary and indiscriminate harassment by state security apparatus. The UAE authorities have violated our basic rights to citizenship, work, education, freedom of speech, movement, and privacy. Furthermore, it is heartbreaking to see how the government uses revoking citizenship as a tool to punish activists and critics of the government. This decision not only leaves us stateless, but deprives us of basic national and human rights. But citizenship revocation is not the only tool used by the authorities to suppress dissent. Families of detainees are often denied access to basic rights and services such as education, employment, and healthcare. Many are even banned from traveling, leaving them trapped in the UAE and struggling to get the help they need. For instance, my sister is currently banned from traveling and is trapped in the UAE without a citizenship, which has stripped her of all her national and human rights. And if you are lucky enough to be able to travel, you're still required to complete a security clearance process to get a job or obtain a trade license. In addition, you are subjected to intermittent, intrusive questioning at the hands of state security officials. The measures taken against relatives of dissidents appear arbitrary and unjustified. None of the restrictions have a clear legal basis, and none of the targeted relatives have been able to appeal, including myself and my family. The UAE authorities not only punishes those who peacefully dissent, but harasses and abuses even those related to them. The UAE's human rights abuses are well documented, yet many Western governments have been happy to continue working with the UAE, ignoring the grave human rights abuses perpetrated by the regime. It is unacceptable that the UAE is allowed to host the COP28 climate summit in November, despite their track record of human rights violations. We cannot continue to turn a blind eye on the human rights situation in the UAE. It is time for democratic governments and international bodies like the UN to take effective actions against the UAE leadership. We need to use all available mechanisms to push for the release of political prisoners, respect for the rule of law, and accountability for human rights abuses. We appeal to the UN to utilize the UPR as a means to advocate for the freedom of all Emiratis who has been unjustly detained for expressing their opinion. In addition, we demand the following from the UAE government. Firstly, the immediate release of my father and all other prisoners who were detained for their human rights activism or whose sentences have ended but are still being held. Secondly, we demand the restoration of our citizenship and the citizenship of all the families of the detainees, including women, men, and children. Finally, we demand the lifting of the travel ban on my sister and all families of the detainees who are banned from traveling. These demands are essential to ensure justice and respect for human rights in the UAE. In conclusion, let us all commit to standing up for human rights and holding governments accountable for their actions. Let us work together to ensure that the UAE and other countries uphold the basic principles of human rights and freedom. And thank you.
Thanks very much, Jenan. I'm really pleased that you raised the issue of the COP, because that's something I certainly wanted to ask about later, and that could be an interesting opportunity to really put these issues on the world stage. But before we get to that, we'll move to our third speaker, Matthew Hedges, who will be giving an overview of what he actually suffered inside prison. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for turning up and listening to us the day after the UAE spoke to the UN Human Rights Council. Following on what you just said, Emma, it's actually quite telling that in the year that the UAE hosts COP, that its human rights policies were under review at the UN. In 7 months' time, it will attract thousands of diplomats to discuss global challenges. And this really is the context of what we're discussing today. The Emirati delegation claimed that they had implemented many policy changes. However, they failed to address many of the direct recommendations for change. Front and center of this focus was the UAE's systematic architecture of abuse and torture, primarily exercised by the state security apparatus. This has been acknowledged by multiple international organizations, such as the Committee Against Torture, and was again highlighted yesterday by demonstrating the parallel legal system which extinguishes any protections for those unfortunate enough to be seized. If you don't believe me, you can listen to the words of the UN, where they say, the committee recommended ensuring that counterterrorism laws and laws related to state security complied fully with international human rights standards, in effect saying that they don't comply with international human rights laws. And the fact that the UAE has still not implemented the Rome Statute or the international conventions recommended by the UN Committee Against Torture demonstrates the willingness to enact this systematic abuse. As previously mentioned, I speak both with expertise, having conducted my doctoral research into the UAE's security state from 2011, but also as a victim of 7 months of torture, abuse, and later I was sentenced to life imprisonment. I'm the first to acknowledge my position of privilege here, and I defended myself ultimately by cooperating and lying my way through interrogations which would last sometimes for 15 hours. It was just about trying to ensure I could get through to the next day and I would be okay at the end of it. After international outcry, however, and the reluctant intervention by my country, I was given a presidential pardon. Yesterday, the UK delegation to the UN directly questioned the UAE on issues relating to my experience, and they asked a question recommending that the UAE should investigate immediately and impartially if a complaint has been made about the treatment of a detainee. This was in relation to myself and to another victim of torture in the UAE, Ali Ahmed, where it's been nearly 4 or 5 years since our release, and after a psychologically draining campaign, we're only now getting the Foreign Office to go and start asking questions to the UAE, let alone demanding responses. In essence, we need, the international community to collaborate and to push towards greater accountability here. But as Ahmed and Janan have said, my experience and that of some others is in stark contrast to the experiences of predominantly Emiratis who are locked into this system of abuse because the country that's supposed to be protecting them is the one actually punishing them, is the one actually abusing them. Yesterday at the UN, the UAE faced multiple questions about the continued imprisonment of human rights defenders. And yet, unless these questions, unless these accusations are backed up with firmer responses, with direct and accountable mechanisms, they will continue to practice this. One of the key narratives, the key ways in which the UAE justifies and defends itself is by discussing the fact of stabilization, of stability over liberty. They can't have a strong state without a stable state. But you have to ask, who does this stability benefit? Certainly not those in prison having already served their sentences. And this is why the UAE's National Human Rights Institution is embedded and it's built into the state itself. The Secretary General is a minister and a former lecturer of law at the Dubai Police Academy, whilst the chairman is a former military officer and the head of strategic communications at the Ministry of Presidential Affairs. There is no way that this institution has independence, freedom, or dislocation from the state's wishes. It is within this context that the UAE has then not only expanded this capacity domestically, but is actually overseeing the export of this. This is primarily undertaken really through the UAE's capture of Interpol. The UAE's Minister of Interior, the Inspector General, Major General Nasser al-Raisi, was appointed to its presidency, and this demonstrates a dangerous pattern of behavior that can legitimize sustained abuse. The UAE has been noted for reprisals against those cooperating with the UN, myself a recent victim of it. But if the UAE can control and dictate an institution such as Interpol, where it can maximize the impact of its leadership in transnational repression and suppression, you have to think, to who does this benefit? How can this help China crack down on Uyghur Muslims abroad? How can this help Russia chase down political dissidents? And this is just the very top line, but it's a pattern that has already started in several cases. And Raisi actually bears the responsibility for every prisoner that goes through the UAE because of his leadership as Inspector General. And this actually is why he is one of several figures where I have filed criminal and civil cases under universal jurisdiction for torture, including in France, where Interpol is headquartered, and he visits often. This is because I don't want my experience to just be forgotten, to be ignored, but to make a case in point so that the UAE is encouraged to stop conducting these practices. But what we've heard today and yesterday is that in the year, as I said, that the UAE hosts COP, actually we've heard that the UAE isn't liberalizing its society and incorporating differing views, but actually is strengthening its repressive elements. I would actually go further than what Ahmed said and say that the Emirati citizens aren't really as much fighting for freedom of speech, but from my experience, they're fighting for more. They're fighting for freedom of thought. And this is even more dangerous because it changes complete behaviors, maybe even without knowing it. And I urge all UN institutions and international states really to sustain their focus and pressure upon the UAE to release, particularly in prisoners of conscience who have already served their sentences. It is ridiculous if, the legitimation of the judiciary and the legislature is supposed to be what props up the whole system, but actually is being exploited by the state itself. It shows it's not fit for purpose. With that sustained pressure, then there may be changes in outcome, and there could be greater freedoms for individuals, but until this occurs, they will continue to get away with it and ensure that others can be strengthened by their leadership. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Matthew, for talking us through that. It seems like no one has such a good idea of the organogram of inside the UAE and how it all works. It's fascinating. Fourth speaker, Falah Sayed, who's going to talk us through the legal context here. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emma, and thank you very much to the panelists. Honestly, your recount is very touching, all of you. I think for my part, it will be just giving you the legal context of what Ahmed, Jenan, and Matthew have been speaking about. And yeah, I mean, as Ahmed was saying, actually, there has been like a mass crackdown on public dissent that's been going on since 2011, but there's been like a turning point in 2013 when 133 lawyers, judges, and academics who signed that petition were arrested, and this mass arrest actually ensued in this mass trial of 94 defendants. And then 61 of those 94 defendants were sentenced to actually between 7 to 15 years in prison. And these sentences were actually mostly based on coerced, self-incriminating confessions, which is even more striking. And this has been, I mean, it's been 10 years now, I guess, since then. And the situation has been going worse. Today, civic space in the UAE is actually non-existent. Several human rights defenders are still imprisoned for acts related to their activism, some beyond their prison sentences, and there's basically no civil society that's present on the ground because it's way too dangerous. And what's really striking, actually, and very common in many Gulf countries is that the legal framework itself gives space and enables the authorities to repress fundamental freedoms. The crackdown on public dissent that's been going on is not happening in a vacuum. There's a real and established modus operandi that is tailored for the repression of human rights defenders. And one of the main legal framework that is used is the counterterrorism legal framework. It basically provides the main legal basis for the authorities to, commit gross violations of human rights and repress any form of dissent. And this is mainly because terrorism is defined very broadly as, acts that are committed with a terrorist purpose or terrorist result. But it's not really defined what is the terrorist purpose, what is the terrorist result. And this vague and broad definition is actually very much intentional. because it allows the authority to, conflate any act of public criticism or democratic opposition with terrorism. And also, this counterterrorism law legal framework, it allows the Minister of Presidential Affairs and the UAE Council of Ministers with the authority to label any organization as terrorists. And since 2021, 4 members of the UAE 94, so one of these 94 defendants in 2013, we call them the UAE 94, 4 members who are living in exile were listed as terrorists. And yeah, I mean, Ahmed actually touched upon this as well. The counterterrorism law actually provides the legal basis, one of the legal basis for the detention of individuals beyond the completion of their prison sentences under the pretext of rehabilitation, which in Arabic is called munasaha, as Ahmed was saying. And munasaha centers are defined basically as administrative units aiming at the enlightenment and reform of persons deemed to pose a terrorist threat or those convicted of terrorist offenses. And I'm quoting here. And yeah, so basically this counterterrorism law gives the legal basis for the establishment of these munasaha centers, and this law was expanded with the adoption of another federal decree to actually, provide for these counseling and rehabilitation centers of holders of terrorist, extremist, and deviant thoughts, which, obviously can mean everything and anything. But yeah, what's also very striking is that the law does not require that the detention in these centers have a certain duration. So the risk is that these centers are used, to incarcerate individuals indefinitely, because, it can be renewed indefinitely, and it can be renewed beyond the completion of their prison sentence. So yeah, what's also could be interesting as well to notice is that these centers work closely with the state security prosecution to keep, and I quote here, monitoring if the individual is likely to commit a terrorist offense. And you see how much, the wording is very broad and just allows to kind of do anything with this. And for now, according to the Emirates Detainee Advocacy Center, there are 56 prisoners of conscience that are detained under this law. Another maybe legal framework that could be interesting to note is the cybercrime law, which was enacted soon after the beginning of the Arab uprising in 2011. This is because they got conscious of the role that is played by social media in the protests. A number of countries, including the UAE, actually adopted a cybercrime law and a media legislation to restrict freedom of expression and everything that's happening online. And they adopted this federal decree number 5 on combating cybercrimes, criminalizing defamation, and it provides for harsh prison sentences up to life imprisonment for anyone who publishes information aiming or calling to overthrow or change the ruling system of the state. This is something that's very striking, actually, to see in a law of a country. Yeah, and maybe the last legal framework that would be interesting to look at is the penal code. It includes a number of restrictive, very restrictive and very concerning provisions. For example, some of the example that I would like to cite is that it punishes with 15 to 25 years imprisonment anyone who insults the president of the UAE, and with 10 to 25 years anyone who insults, mocks, harms the reputation, prestige, or statute of the state, its flag, its emblem, its symbol, or any of its institutions. I mean, this is as well very, very striking to see black and white in a penal code. And yeah, I mean, with this in mind, we can really clearly see that the authorities are here able to rely on a vast number of very vague and broad provisions in their penal code, cybercrime law, and counterterrorism law, which, you know, kind of have opened the door to arbitrary interpretation of these laws. And there have therefore been used to charge and sentence anyone who's acting on the basis of free speech. And yeah, I mean, obviously all the provisions that I've cited here, you know, violate the principles of legal certainty, and they definitely contravene international human rights standard. And maybe one last thing to actually keep in mind is that the main authority that is here to apply this legal framework and that basically gives it effect is the state security apparatus. It's the main entity that's responsible for dealing with terrorism and state security issues. And it's been responsible for, you know, systematic and widespread human rights abuses, including this massive crackdown on peaceful dissent since 2011. You know, to such an extent that, as I said, you know, civic space is completely annihilated and is not existent in the UAE. And it was also responsible for the detention of the UAE 94. This state security apparatus, the SSA, is actually based on a law, the SSA law, but this law actually has never been made public. EDAC, so the Emirates Detainees Advocacy Center, were able to get a 2003 version of this law. And according to this version, we can see that the SSA acts without any institutional, judicial, or financial oversight. And it reports directly to the president of the UAE. And, you know, it's granted very broad powers, for instance, gathering and analyzing information on any political activity happening in the country. And I quote here, monitor social phenomena, you know, whatever that means. And also, you know, the president of the SSA can actually place suspects in custody for up to 3 months. I don't know, I don't think I'm going to go as well more in detail in, you know, the lack of independence in the judiciary or fair trial, but as you can see, you know, people get arrested, they get detained, and it's not just they're detained, no. They go through a whole process where the executive, where everything, the system is so centralized with the executive to control and further a repressive agenda, whether it's when you appear before the court or when you actually go before the court, when you get into the detention centers, the practice of torture and using forced confessions that were extracted under torture. But yeah, thank you very much.
No, thank you. Really interesting, and I have so many questions, but let's focus maybe on the issue of redress, and since we're on that, Jenan said earlier that it wasn't possible to even file an appeal. So, Falah, can you talk us through, in these circumstances, what options for legal redress are there for the families of the detained?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Emma. That's like the question, I guess, the big question that everybody asks. I think especially for for where I work at MENA Rights Group, what we do is mostly file, you know, individual complaints and use human rights mechanisms that are available with the UN special procedures. We can file individual complaints with Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, Working Group on Enforced Disappearances. We can ask special rapporteurs to issue communications to the countries. There's also maybe, but these are, you know, more known avenues for legal remedies. Maybe other possibilities that could also be explored would be the business and human rights angle, for instance. More and more European countries and European investors are investing in these countries, and in relation to the UAE or Saudi Arabia, for instance. So that could be an angle that it could also be approached, but also as Matthew said in his speech, universal jurisdiction is a very, very important tool. And Emiratis like to come to Europe. And if you spot someone, especially to Geneva, actually, they like coming to Geneva. So if you spot someone, sipping their coffee somewhere in Europe, and you know that this person might be complicit in some forms of torture, the head of a detention center, for instance, or someone as such, you can, contact your local NGO, your local police, and be able to file a complaint on the basis of universal jurisdiction. Yeah.
If it's in Switzerland, I understand you'll need a fax machine. The prosecutor's office takes them by fax, but hopefully the NGOs have them, and they can respond quickly enough. On redress, I could see Matthew wanted to come in there, since you've got, how many is it, seven cases currently?
No.
But talk to us about what efforts you're trying, and also why you use the word reluctant for the UK. Why do you get the impression that your own government is reluctant to help in this respect?
Sure, so I suppose going in reverse, the UK hasn't, it's sent official communications note verbals to the UAE. Again, this was not prompt, efficient. This did not prevent torture and abuse from occurring. It also, they only really responded once the case had gone public, and so their comments to the UN yesterday, whilst they were absolutely welcome in my regard, the lack of effort and support that I haven't had for the past 4 years. If they were going to do this 4 years later, why can they do it straight away? No, it's required. This wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been participating, if I hadn't been trying to exercise these legal avenues by trying to seek justice on my own. It's then, they have been absolutely reluctant, because there's been, they aren't proactive in this, they are extremely reactive. Before I was going to discuss, before I answer the question about the judicial, the trying to find accountability and justice, I was going to provide the observations from the opposite perspective. So, if you are if you get sucked into the state security world, and you have to tell me if I'm wrong, but you can't be represented by any lawyer, and lawyers that have represented defendants, and Mohammed Darwish, this happened with him, I believe, they have then been imprisoned themselves for representing people. And this is what happened with Mohammed Darwish. He was representing people, and then he got imprisoned under those same laws. When my wife tried to get a lawyer for me to represent me, the British Embassy recommended someone who had been both the prosecuting lawyer and the defendant lawyer in a case. So again, speaking about the independence of the judiciary, I couldn't really think of a better example than this. And then the State Security Authority, to further express that centrality of authority and the lack of separation, it's run by the now Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, or the eldest son of the president. It's direct. It isn't to have the views and observations of the state of the communal good, but really regime security, in a similar way that you would hear the Republican Guard in Iraq, right? Or what you would hear in Syria. It's not designed for the broader good. In terms of personal cases, we have a civil case in the UK, and the Parliamentary Ombudsman is soon to be releasing documentation and evidence relating to the FCO's failure to support me based on the FCO documentation. But we then have a criminal case based on universal jurisdiction in France, and this is, as I mentioned, it's because Raisi, as one of the candidates, as president of Interpol, based in Lyon, he has to then travel to Interpol often, and so there is then that basis and foundation for a judge to accept taking that responsibility on, because of course there will be a degree of political ramification, but you need to be brave, you need to be bold, and accept the rightness, the integrity of the case for its merits, not for potential international relations. So some are more willing than others, but if you can present a strong enough case and justify it, then there's no reason why it can't move forward. I say that it makes it sound easy, but there are a lot of other moving parts that you need to be able to succeed.
Yeah, and presumably you have a lot more levers at your disposition than people within the country as well.
Within the country, you don't have anything. It's non-existent, because your family are targeted, because anyone you know is targeted. It becomes an all-encompassing mess. If you're based outside the country, you still need to. There's still other issues, but I'm lucky enough to be able to have support to be able to push through. So I'm making sure I do.
Good for you. Let's go to Ahmed now. This idea of going through this counseling phase, as you described it, for your brother since his 10-year sentence expired. I'm wondering, presumably nobody who's gone through that has actually come out to talk about it. I don't know if that's the case, Falah, maybe you could answer later, but are you concerned about him? He's elderly, I understand. He's more than 70. What are your concerns for his health and this second stage of detention? Is it any different from the first phase, from the first 10 years?
Yes, actually, we're concerned of all of the detainees, not only my brother, because it's been 10 years, we don't know what happens inside. And to be very clear and to give the evidence of that there's something very bad happened inside and very bad situation they are in, the United Arab Emirates Authority banned any human rights organization or activist to visit the prisons. So that shows how bad is inside. For 10 years, no one can go inside. And more than that, since the pandemic happened, no one could visit those prisoners, those detainees. It's more than 4 years now. They can't see their situation, they can't see their health, but they can get some calls sometimes from them. And some of them disappeared for 1 year without any call as well. So what is the situation inside? I'm aware about my brother and the other detainees who are citizens and they have the rights to talk about them today and to show the world how is bad situation they are in, that their health, they are in a bad health, no care. And if we want to remember someone who was in really bad situation, Alia Abdel Noor. If we remember Alia Abdel Noor, who had cancer and did not have care for that, and she was at the end, she had no hope to be alive, and the doctor said that she will die soon. They did not let her even die with her family in peaceful. This is the situation now for our detainees. And my brother, who is 70 years old, and his friends as well, like Hamad Ruqayt and the others, they are, maybe Hamad Ruqayt is now he's in 75 years old now. They are in bad situation, and we are really concerned about their health and even their mental health and everything like that. That include our family as well. My mother, who lost two of her sons, one of them me, but I'm in a good situation. I can call her. She can know that I'm in a good situation. Thanks God, and thanks God that I can talk. God gave me this opportunity to talk about my brother and the others. Now she is in very bad health because she can't know about her son, what is happening there. Yeah.
I've got two more questions which I'd like to throw at the panelists, but then please, if there are questions from the audience, I'd like to take them. So the first one, can we get some more feedback from yesterday's UPR process on how it went? Matthew, you mentioned the fact that the UK raised detainees. I saw that the US delegation did as well. But I didn't get the impression that it was a grilling. There were no names. What was the feedback on that? Were you satisfied with the level of scrutiny that the UAE was put under in yesterday's session? Whoever wants to take it.
I can take it very briefly. What was kind of a positive aspect that I personally saw is that some of the countries actually got a grasp of the problematic legal framework that is in the UAE. So there was some recommendations on not using the counterterrorism law to prosecute, sentence, and charge human rights defenders. So they were sensitive to that legal framework. They were sensitive to the, detention of prisoners of conscience beyond their prison sentences as well. So that was a positive aspect that I saw. But I mean, then many of the recommendations were about, ratifying the main legal conventions, because the UAE has not ratified the most important human rights conventions. So, I mean, this is something positive, but very classic, I guess. And yeah, I think that's kind of like some of my observations, but I don't know if the other panelists have something more to add.
Yeah, thanks for that. Matthew, what did you think?
So, you're right, multiple states, including the UK, did acknowledge shortcomings in the UAE's human rights system. And again, you're correct when you say that it was very light. It wasn't a grilling. It was more of an acknowledgement rather than a criticism. And it seems strange because of the context of COP being held in the UAE this year at a UN event, that there is no greater time to leverage this position to support and drive change. How can others watching, private individuals, private entities, other states, how can they try to work alongside the UAE at this climate change conference, which is the biggest issue of the world, if it's very clear that they are abusing and torturing individuals? And this really is one of the most glaring practices that was shown throughout the documentation, but also the UAE's what's it called? How they diverted attention from other issues. So they spoke a lot about many of the instructions of the policies that they have enacted. But it was very plain and very clear where they hadn't made any progress, or when they chose not to acknowledge certain structural issues like the state security, like the use of torture, like the abuse of the counterterrorism laws, the fact that the special rapporteur for on torture hasn't been able to visit the UAE. These types of actions were highlighted. So it's not that the international community can feign ignorance. They know it. They're complicit by not pushing it harder, by not trying to push this.
Then my second question is, how do we use COP? And actually, it's not just COP. It's the WTO also has a meeting in Abu Dhabi, MC13, which is supposed to happen early next year. So there's two events coming up when the UAE is going to be under scrutiny. How will activists leverage this? What's the best way to do it? Is there a strategy?
Based on yesterday, it's not about trying to engage governments because they would like to try and remain neutral. And there's also an absolute fair assessment that, you know, who is the UK, the US, Europe to lecture on human rights when they have their own issues. Fundamentally, I understand, no problem. So then you have to go and talk to private entities, to the companies that are involved, the multi-stakeholder aspect, and pressure them if they operate within a neoliberal, within a commercial environment. Well, then you divest, then you go and choose a competitor to force that change. And this has been shown in other commercial behaviors. So if you can then pressure commercial companies to refrain from that engagement, that's great. But you know, as an individual, if you want to be part of the process, you know, write a letter to your MP, to you know, your constituent representative. There's a whole range. Maybe I'm a bit pessimistic. But I'll say go to the commercial companies because they're the ones they're the ones whose pockets will hurt, and they're more likely to change than the government who tends to move very, very slowly.
Well, I'd like to see if there are questions from the floor. Yes, we have one here from Mr. De Sapinto. Did not disappoint. Let me get you a mic. Okay, one's coming your way. And just introduce yourself.
Martin De Sapinto, independent investigator, former colleague of Emma. Matthew, a couple of years before your arrest, the UK had another citizen in a Dubai prison, David Hay, who had been the former chairman of Leeds United football club. Somebody, I think it was Falah who suggested that we could use investment as a soft power type of arm to try and convince repressive countries to maybe ease up or be more open about their human rights record. What do you think about the possibility of this going in the other direction, of preventing repressive regimes from acquiring trophy assets across the world, like football clubs, like hotels, like other high value, high visibility, soft power type assets? Second question also, for Matthew specifically. At the weekend, we had a lot of silent, peaceful protesters being arrested in the UK at the coronation. How do you think that affects the country's ability to actually go out and talk to other countries about their human rights records?
Yeah, so the first point, sadly, in the case of the UK, it's shown a high degree of selectivity in regards to how they choose to critique some of these soft power engagements. So when it comes, after a war has started when Russia invaded Ukraine, then the UK decides to assess some of these marquee investments, but again, very selectively. It may impact a Chelsea football club, but it won't impact Lord Lebedev. This is a little bit specific, but it shows the nature of it's not really something that the UK takes too seriously, and this is in a private perspective. We've seen in the US, say, with lobbying, this is still highly, it's an epidemic really that directly impacts decision-making. But even though this continues to come out in the press, this is, people are aware of what's happening, decisions are still being influenced, and people are part of that same process. Can we stop it? Ideally, yes, but realistically, no, because there are too many vested interests in sustaining it. The UK's position of power means, and its current situation, they need to continue attracting people, and if they make it uncompetitive, if they start pushing people away, then it won't have that same standing it once had. I think James Cleverly, the current Foreign Secretary, is I was speaking with Rodney, my barrister, about this today. James Cleverly is that complete middle ground where he doesn't ever want to make any decision to be confrontative. He just wants to try and keep as many people happy. If you read the Integrated Review Reform, he talks about the UK needs to be resilient, but then also being pragmatic. You're not doing anything. Then specific in regards to the weekend, 100%. If you're cracking down on protesters, if you're doing things unilaterally, if you're speaking in a certain way, I said, absolutely. Why would they go and try and take this lecturing from you, from the UK, from the US, from France? It's no better, and it's been happening for a long time. It's a degree of that, but then also how it's like a pendulum. They might be friendly with you in one way, and then criticize you in another. And that's why that shift to Russia and China, at least you know what you're getting. You know they're going to act in this way, they'll get your support, and that's that. They're not going to turn around and say something else. They're going to have a second face. That's it. It's a very direct, clear bargain of sorts.
Interesting. Any other questions from the floor?
Yes, hello, Michael Kambata from the Gulf Center for Human Rights. I'm trying to find some good news here where I can. I realize it's very thin on the ground, but I was just wondering if you could share any examples of where pressure has been effective for any sort of change, in particular for detainees who are Emirati. Obviously, Matthew has, you point out, you had a rather privileged position, and the foreigners have their governments at least. But have you seen anything that you would want to share where pressure has been felt by the Emirati authorities that has made them move? I realize that's a hard and difficult question from your faces, but if you have anything to share, I think that would be helpful.
Actually, that happened in 2012, as I remember. The same situation that we are in now, the period of reviewing for human rights. We actually lost the hope to have the file to go to a trial. They actually in a secret prisons, so we didn't have the hope. Before the period review, they transferred their file after a really good pressure from the human rights organizations here in the UN. They transferred the file, and the relative of the detainees could see their relative, the detainees. Even it was bad situation, but they saw them. They went to the trial. It was not a real trial, it was fake. Everything that it was organized by the government, the authority, but at least they were taken from the secret prison. So was that good? Was that show a little bit the pressure? Yeah, can do something at that time. Since that time, we didn't see a real thing happen, even especially when Matthew said about the government, what we expect that they will make some pressure on the United Arab Emirates. There was no pressure. But the the human rights organization, they did their job, they tried to do something, but unfortunately we didn't see anything better than the situation that we have.
Maybe one, the case related to 1MDB with the one, he was underneath Sheikh Mansour. He was taken to prison. I think he was taken to general prison, but then he was shortly released afterwards. The difference being that there is like direct political involvement and huge amounts of fraud that involved. Had links, to members of the ruling family. There is that issue. But to show the extent, the State Security Authority in 2014, 15, maybe later, they detained the ruler of Ras Al Khaimah. They took him to Abu Dhabi overnight. They released him afterwards, but it shows that they have not just the ability, but the will to exercise this. So if there is pressure only works because it's exceeded their ability to handle it. And this hasn't really happened. It's certainly, for the UAE to do it to their own citizens would have to be epic, really.
Maybe very quickly, there's also the case of Sharif Osman, who was the Egyptian US political presenter, but I'm not the one who has personally worked on this case, so I'm not very comfortable talking about it more. It's my colleagues who are present here in the room who can tell you more about it. But yeah, it's like one example where pressure has worked, but I know that your question was more related to Emiratis, so he was a US citizen, and I think this was something that has played in his favor, of course.
Can I add something? Actually, one of the positive things about the pressure that we have now, that if we would not have, if we did not have this pressure, I think the situation will be worse than what we see now. That's the, I can say, the positive thing now from the pressure.
Yeah, and to take the example of another country, Egypt, when we saw the COP, it was family members who actually showed up at the conference. So I think it's the individual stories as well, when the media spotlight is there.
So, but then with this family, he still hasn't had that same, there was a lot of pressure, but the Egyptian authorities were able to handle it and manage it. Mm-hmm. There hasn't been that same, there still hasn't been, the UK government has, my last memory, they still hadn't had any engagement with the imprisoned. Mm-hmm. The family hadn't been able to, they could speak by phone every month or every few weeks, I think, but still no consular visit. So a case, like a colleague, a fellow victim, Ali Ahmed, who was taken by the police, he was stabbed, the police sliced him with knives. It was only after that they discovered really that he had a British passport that the whole demeanor and approach to him changed. It was some form of like an institutional racism and perspective that they could just do this at will. So there are levels to the amount of pressure they feel as they can handle.
Listen, are there any other questions in the room or on our online platform at all? Otherwise, I'd just like to thank the speakers so much for joining us. I learned so much, and thank you for sharing your stories.